Good morning, guys. It's our first day of rain, so we're going up to Nottingham City and Nottingham Castle, and we'll see you there. And here we are. We've arrived at Nottingham Castle. This. What the hell? Have you seen this outlaw? Oh, you could try on me. Nicely done. Hey! Hey! Well done, babe. It is tricky, isn't it? Yeah, well done. Good job. Yeah! Hey, well done, babe. You're Little John's equal.
To guess what this room was originally used for?
Giving wine?
Well, an expert clearly, yeah, it was a wine cellar. Fair enough. It was a wine cellar created in 1670, but its history goes back a bit before that into the 1640s with the English Civil War between the parliamentarians and the royalists. And the parliamentarians win. In doing so, they dissolve the English monarchy. How do they do that? They take the current king, Charles I, and they chop his head off. It's a pretty solid way to get rid of any monarchy, but I am legally required to ask you don't try this at home. Now, moving forward, there is an 11-year period with no king or queen in the country. We are ruled over by the Parliament instead, and eventually the Parliament decide to destroy Nottingham Castle about 5 years into their reign, so that it cannot be used against them. That is why there has not been a castle on these grounds for about 370 years. Now, moving forward, after that 11-year period comes and goes, the Parliament decide to re-establish the English monarchy. Kind of ironic, considering they spent 40 years in a civil war getting rid of it. But either way, they restore the monarchy by going and getting the son of King Charles I, who, stick with me here, was called King Charles II. Now, when King Charles II is brought back, he brings back all of his friends from France with him, and he makes them nobility. In fact, he names one of them in particular the first Duke of Newcastle, and then gifts him this land. Technically, I have been asked not to say he was gifted this land, as I've been informed it wasn't an objective gift, but he did offer this land to his friend at a reduced price, with no competition, after giving him a load of money. So take that as you will. Moving forward, the first Duke of Newcastle asked for the construction of the ducal palace and then this wine cellar, and they finished construction in 1670, though ironically the Duke in question waited so long for a place to live, he actually dies waiting, in the December of 1668. Eventually we move forward to the 1830s. In 1831, we have the Great Reform Act, a parliamentary act that would have allowed more men to be able to vote. Now, the Great Reform Act was eventually passed in 1832 on its second attempt. On its first attempt in 1831, it was shot down by the House of Lords, who, to be clear, one of their members was the fourth Duke of Newcastle, who was the current owner of this palace. Now, to put that into context for all of you, he was one of 10 men in Nottingham who could vote. And he voted so that everyone else in Nottingham couldn't vote. As you can imagine, he was a very well-liked individual. So much so, the good people of Nottingham decided to show their appreciation by burning his house to the ground. In what later became known as the Great Reform Riots, of which you can see the aftermath of the Great Reform Riots in this back corner behind me and over this archway. You can see all the scorch marks across this archway. Now, the palace remained a burnt husk for 44 years, being bought out in 1875. Now, it spent 3 years being refurbished by the Nottingham Council, eventually opening in 1878. As the art gallery, it remains as until this very day. Finally, the Western Passage at the bottom of the room. We cannot go down there. Namely because of the 2 gates it now leads to, one of them will now take you into somebody's back garden. That is genuinely true, by the way. They were not happy to see us. Now, with that being said, do you guys have any questions on this matter on the room so far, or shall we get moving to our second room? Any questions, guys?
No.
I tend to find if there's no questions, it usually means one of 2 things. Either number 1, I'm explaining this all really well, or number 2, you're all sick of listening to me already. And if it's the latter, I apologise, because you're stuck with me for 2 more rooms. Speaking of, let's get to the second room, shall we? Alonzi? Romolo's Cave. This is named after one Stephen Romolo, who was the constable of the castle in the 1350s. And as constable, he was responsible for locking people up. And he was a very enthusiastic man. He was very well known for giving out extremely harsh prison sentences for extremely minor crimes. In fact, he once gave a woman a 15-year prison sentence because she attempted to steal his prized goose. A goose that he supposedly prized, having plucked the feathers from it, using them as a quill, like an old-fashioned pen to write with. Of course, that means he gave this woman a decade and a half in jail for attempting to steal his pencil case. Believe it or not, he was not a very well-liked man. In fact, despite how hated and reviled he was, he would go on to own Nottingham Castle while he was alive and make several improvements to it, such as the cave you're standing in currently, which is named after him. Ironically, he actually named everything that he built on the castle grounds, he named after himself. Genuinely true. So we have Romolo's Cave, there is also Romolo's Tower, Romolo's Lookout, and Romolo's Church. I don't even know what to say. I usually have a follow-up joke there, but I think that one could just kind of speak for itself, doesn't it? So, I will ask though, what do you think this room was originally used for then, being named after him?
Prisoners?
No, it wasn't used for prisoners or a jail cell. To be clear, you should have the modern day equivalent of this room in all of your homes. And seeing as this is a room you should all have in your houses, if you say prisoners again, I will leave. Any guesses? You should have this room in your house.
Kitchen.
Kitchen, correct, it's a kitchen. This is a servant's preparation kitchen in which the servants would have prepared food but not cooked it. To be clear, they would not have cooked any food in this room because it does not make sense to cook somebody a hot meal, only to have to carry it 3 stories upstairs to actually feed anyone. Seeing that the food would become cold, dropped, or, if they were very lucky, have sand dripped into it from the ceiling, for a crunchy little aftertaste I'm sure the Lord would appreciate. Now, moving forward, the ditch to my left was used to collect rainwater that the servants washed their clothing in. The problem being is that when you wash your clothing in sandstone, you may find sand and or stone in your clothing. So, I'd like to remind you this is a preparation kitchen, meaning its main usage was in the preparation of animal carcasses, i.e. to skin, gut and clean them. So, your choices as a servant in the 1350s, which already isn't a great gig to start with, was to walk around in clothing smeared with guts and viscera, or you could opt to wash your clothing and have it be filled with sand and rock shards. Take your pick. Now, to my right, over here, this chute was used officially in order to remove food waste, sort of like a medieval bin. But unofficially, we believe it was used to remove the servants' own waste. Going down that chute, out to the side of the cliff we find ourselves in currently, out of their headspace, and probably onto somebody else's. Finally, the window at the top of the room, carved out in the 1350s, but refurbished in the 1500s, hence the differing stonework you can see. But its origin date of the 1350s I find quite humorous, because that would then mean that those living in the 1350s clearly understood the need for proper ventilation in their kitchen area, and then also felt the need to use it as a toilet. Priorities change with time, I guess. But, does anyone have any questions on Mr. Romolo or the room you're currently in? Any questions, guys? Fair enough. In which case, if you guys would like to head to the third and final room, King David's dungeon. I do have say, please do not sit directly on the lights because they can break that way. So please make extra effort to not sit on the lights. Now, would anyone like to guess when this room was made? What century was this room made in? And before you take a guess, don't feel bad about taking a shot in the dark and getting it wrong. I once had a group unironically say the 1980s. Which I would like to point out is not even a century to begin with. So, trust me when I say, I've heard worse. With that being said, does anyone want to guess what century this room was made in?
15th.
Not the 15th century, it's actually
11th.
before that. Well, there you go, the 11th century, straight off the bat. So, the 11th century, yes, in 1066 was the Battle of Hastings, a very famous British battle won by William the Conqueror. He asks for the construction of the castle to keep an eye over Middle England, and it finishes construction 2 years later, in 1068, originally made out of wood, before later being upgraded to stone in the 1190s. But, because we believe this room is dated to the original castle, that means that in 46 years, this room will be 1,000 years old. Now, addressing the elephant in the room, behind me we have our Norman arches, but just going to let you guys in on a little secret. The arch I have my hand on currently is fake. These are fake Norman arches, put in the 1700s by the second Duke of Newcastle in his misguided attempt to recreate an original Norman arch. How do we know that he was trying to recreate an original Norman arch? That is because behind it, we are believed to have an original Norman arch. So, behind the fake one, there is a real Norman arch, dated to the 1190s. What's hilarious about these fake arches in front is that, to be clear, they're shaped completely wrong. A Norman arch would eventually come to a flat top, whereas these go to a straight point. Now, to be clear, that means that a man from the 1700s came down to this room and tried to recreate a style of arch from the 12th century using a style of arch that wouldn't exist until the 15th century. That is really dumb when you stop and think about it. It gets even worse when you realise that when these arches were put in, they were put in way too far to the right. They don't match up with the original arch whatsoever. If they did match up with the original arch, we wouldn't see the original arch. And we still can. In fact, these arches, the fake ones, are in such a state that they've actually led to me, admittedly I should say, a little unprofessionally, referring to them as the McDonald's arches. Shaped like an M and very fake. Now, the original arch suggests this room is ceremonial in origin. Essentially, it is a church. This is an old church, supported by the fact that in the 1350s they built a brand new church directly above this room. They built their brand new church directly above us, meaning that in the 1350s this room was outdated and would need conversion into something more useful to them. It was either converted into food storage as a result of the preparation kitchen built next door, or it could have been converted into a crypt to store dead bodies in before moving them onto their final resting place. However, to me, it does not make sense to build a brand new preparation kitchen next door and then fill the room next to it full of dead bodies. Unless you're really desperate for meat. Moving on now, we can talk about the namesake of this room, King David. And he was the king of what country? Any guesses? What country did King David rule over?
Scotland.
Correct! Scotland! First answer. Kind of throw me off a bit. I'm not used to people getting it right first try. Yes, it was Scotland. Well done. I'd like to ask that question, arbitrary though it may seem, because I get some great answers on these talks. Despite the fact that the correct answer is on the wall of the waiting room above us, and the fact that he was a king in the 1300s, I have been informed by other groups that King David was the King of America, the King of Australia, and my personal favourite, the King of Africa. Not a country in Africa, mind any of you, just the whole thing. I had one little girl tell me he was the King of Mars, which isn't even the right planet. But well deduced he was the King of Scotland, and he was inaugurated as the King of Scotland at the ripe old age of 4. He was 4 years old and king, and at his inauguration, at the age of 4, they married him to an English princess who was 7. So they married a 4-year-old and a 7-year-old, and they were the respective king and queen of Scotland at the time. They believed that a marriage between the Scottish prince and the English princess would prevent the English and the Scottish from fighting forevermore. It didn't work. To the best of my knowledge anyway, we're still at war with them. A tenuous joke, I know, but I've told that with many Scottish people on my cave tour, and not one of them actually disagreed with me as of yet, so I'm still waiting for that one to run out. Either way, King David grows up to become 19, and he's good friends with the King of France, who is currently at war with the King of England, no surprise there. So, the King of France asks David to invade England, and David agrees. So much for the peace treaty. David returned home to Scotland, gathered up his army, marched south towards England, but he only made it about as far as Durham, give or take anyway, before losing at the Battle of Neville's Cross to a ragtag army of peasants and farmers. Not a very successful military campaign. In fact, the Scottish army was notoriously bad. They still felt it necessary to run into battle naked in order to intimidate their enemies. Which I'm sure looks great on paper. But do any of you know what weapon the English were most famous for at the time?
Spears?
No, not spears, they were more of a Greco-Roman. Correct, the English longbow. Now, another question for the more astute amongst you. Does anyone know the name of the event in which 1,000 naked Scottishmen run across an open field into oncoming longbow fire? A solid guess, I'll give you that. But personally, I call it target practice. And not wanting to be outshone by his men, King David takes it upon himself to receive not 1, but 2 arrows during this battle. Luckily for him, he blocks them with his face. He takes 2 arrows to the face in the 1350s and lives. He walks it off amazingly, and he goes on to live for the 25 years. Now, do any of you know how arrows were shaped back in the 1350s? What type of arrows did they use?
Were they just a point?
No, it was a specific type of point. You see, they were barbed, which means they were shaped like a Christmas tree.
Yeah.
Which means they were very easy to go in.
Yeah.
They were not easy to get back out. So, King David had 2 of those in his face. Now, the surgeons whose job it was to remove them from his face gave up. And they snapped the arrowheads off and left them in his brain for the rest of his years. And he complained about splitting headaches. But all things considered, I still think he got off pretty easy, making another 25 years in all. Supposedly, there is a story where 10 years after this event, he is praying one day and sneezes and one of the arrowheads pops out.
Wow.
I suppose that was a literal weight off his mind. It was an arrow of fear. I'll stop. So, King David was brought down to this room where he spent 11 years incarcerated down here. And he spent his time carving the word of Christ onto this green wall with his bare fingernails.
That's
Theoretically possible, you could make incisions in the wall with your fingernails. It is genuinely that easy. But he would not, so I'm afraid. You see, King David was not down here for 11 years. That has been exaggerated over time. In reality, King David spent a grand total of 3 weeks here. And even when he was kept at Nottingham Castle for those 3 weeks, he was not kept in this room. He was kept on the total other side of the castle grounds in the actual dungeons. Just to be clear with you guys, despite the fact that this room is called King David's Dungeon, it is extremely unlikely that this room ever saw King David or was a dungeon. The only reason we call it King David's Dungeon is because of the second Duke of Newcastle, the aforementioned moron who put the fake arches in. He was looking for King David's dungeon when he created the passageway to my right, refinding this room in the early 1700s. Now, as I say, he was looking for King David's dungeon, and this was the first new room he came across. So what do you think he did with it? He lied! He said it was King David's dungeon, and it's been known as King David's dungeon ever since. Despite the fact that, as I just mentioned, he literally couldn't have been more wrong if he tried. But with all that being said, does anyone have any questions on anything I've discussed today, or shall we head up and out of the cave? Any questions, guys?
So these archways, they were like, there was hallways going like to the other side of the castle from here, or?
Yes and no. Originally, if you take away the initial arch and just leave the first, if you just keep the first arch, originally you would have had to scrap all this red brickwork and the grey brickwork back here, and it would have been a passageway, but it wouldn't have led to another side of the castle. It would have led to a personal prayer room. You see, the idea was you would come down to the church-like area, and you would pass through a physical barrier, being the Norman Arch, and then you could enter a more spiritual area where you could then speak to God. It was essentially like a really old-fashioned version of a Catholic confession booth. It's a vague way of putting it, I know, but that's essentially what it was. In the 1350s, when this room likely became food storage, we believe that that room was tunnel was converted from a prayer room into a bakery. So, any other questions? Going once.
There's gonna be, it's a weird one. Did King David show any change? Was there any record of his personality changing with the arrows in his room?
Well, I would assume, considering that he wrote in his diary complaining about splitting headaches, he was a lot grumpier. I would imagine that was very likely.
Take the arrows out with the fruit, wasn't there, at one time?
So the arrows, as far as and again, we can't confirm it, but we I believe one of the arrows lodged into his cheekbone, and another one went into his temple, but it was a shallow enough angle to essentially lodge into his skull without touching the brain, essentially. It was extremely lucky, yes. Well, lucky if you can't be having in the face. In the face with two arrows, you know. You'd be luckier if none of them hit you to begin with. After you get running into battle naked, I guess. But on the bright side, he would have been naked on a horse, so I guess that's something. Any other questions?
What did he die of?
I'm not actually entirely sure what he died of. To be honest, it was likely just complications of old age. You have to understand that even though he was 44, that was considered an old age at the time. The average life expectancy was 34, which, to be clear, means that when you were 17, you were middle-aged. Can you imagine having a midlife crisis at 17? To be clear, his wife, though, the one he married when she was 7, she lived into her 80s.
Wow.
Which is the modern day equivalent of somebody living to about 165.
Wow.
They actually believe she was keeping herself alive with witchcraft in the back end of her life. So there you go. Any other questions? Well, fair enough. I have about maybe 15 minutes at most until the next cave door, so I'm going to get moving. So, if everyone would like to follow me, we can head up and out of the cave. Now, with all that being said, I do have one more thing to go through, which is the fact that there is a step there. And on my first day, nobody warned me there was a step there. So I went into the wall behind me. So I make a personal point at stopping all my cave groups here to let you know there is a step there. Please be careful of the step. When you leave, feel free to head to your right up to the Rebellion Gallery to learn more about the castle. Alternatively, you can walk round the wall into the Robin Hood experience in order to play on the games there within. Either way, I'd like to thank you all for joining me on this tour. You've been a wonderful cave group. Thank you for listening to me ramble the last half an hour, and I hope you all have a lovely day.
Thank you.
Thank you. My ego appreciates that.